As the Terran Alliance neared the 23rd century, it was fast approaching the end of its life cycle. Its formation could be likened to that of a star, sending out the light of mankind to settle distant space, but pulling in all of the materials and resources within its reach to feed an insatiable fire. At first, it had swelled in size, but imposing their beliefs and control onto an ever greater number of colonies had burned through the last of Earth's energy, and soon, the pressure pushing back from the outer reaches would overcome it. When that happened, stellar collapse would follow. The Terran Alliance wasn't quite yet the monolithic superstate that it's often remembered as. In many ways, the manner in which it had grown in power allowed it to remain separate from the old Earth countries, rather than above them. Its bureaucrats and policymakers answered only to themselves, but the more powerful member nations still retained a high degree of autonomy. This was particularly true in military strength, where the individual states retained the lion's share of the planet's weapons, though these forces began to atrophy in the wake of the wars that brought the remaining separatists kicking and screaming into the Union. Around this time, the Terran Alliance armed forces received a rebranding, henceforth known as the Alliance Global Militia. As the crackdown on anti-government factions continued, those people attempted to use what connections they still had to smuggle themselves off-world. Terra was no longer a safe place to be for anyone who refused to conform. Many of those who could not afford to book passage out of the system ended up settling in the asteroid belt, Trojans, or even the distant Kuiper belt. There is arguably no more fiercely independent group of people alive today than the reclusive Belters, a legacy of their refugee ancestors. Geneva did its best to track the movement of those fleeing Earth, but the task was almost impossible. The core systems were well established by this point and firmly in the pocket of the Alliance, driving this latest wave of colonists to settle within the frontier outer reaches. In 2195, a second grand survey was completed, this one reporting 204 worlds within 85 light-years. But again, this didn't accurately reflect the true extent of human expansion. Anticipating that the Alliance Navy would continue to pursue them despite the challenges, the rebels prepared for future confrontations. They received aid from the heir to the Ryan cartel, whose ice ships spent nearly as much time smuggling arms out to the colonies as they did delivering water. In the last decade of the 22nd century, the Department of Mega Engineering began Project Aphrodite, the terraforming of Venus. This was at the time the most ambitious venture mankind had ever undertaken, and arguably still is to this day. Somewhat amusingly, the terraforming of Venus began on Mercury, where uncountable tons of calcium were extracted from the crust to feed the production of atmosphere-altering blue-green algae. Comets were again looked at as a means of introducing new elements to the planet, but deemed insufficient. Instead, Aphrodite turned to Titan to supply them with the required hydrogen gas, in turn fueling the development of Saturn's moon. The first stage of this endeavour was to build living space for the workers. The surface was far too hot to live on, so instead they fabricated numerous space factories alongside the Venusian orbital habitat. Though these were of significant size, they were minuscule compared to what followed. A colossal orbital shade, thousands of kilometers wide, the largest object ever assembled in human history. Positioned at a Lagrange point partway between Venus and the Sun, this created a permanent partial eclipse above the planet, the first stage in lowering the 460-degree surface temperature. The starlight side of this sun umbrella was covered in immense solar panels, the energy of which would be more than sufficient to power any future colony. but in the meantime was beamed out to the asteroid belt as a means of reducing rocks to slag. Throughout its existence, the parliamentary representatives of the Terran Alliance, and even its predecessor the Western Alliance, were appointed by a country's head of state. There was no democratic process to determine who would sit in that chair. As such, most of the world's population remained politically apathetic towards the institution. The position was deemed best suited to relatively junior politicians, who might later graduate to more important roles at home or as foreign ambassadors. But as the organization grew in power, they found themselves wielding ever greater authority without having to answer to an electorate. In theory, a country could appoint a different representative at any time, and so their actions were kept in check by another government body, typically a democratic one. But such actions risked being perceived as interfering with the Alliance's affairs. The first political parties at the Geneva Parliament began to emerge not long after space colonization began. Throughout the 22nd century, political discourse had been dominated by the so-called Expansionist Party, who advocated for continued growth and domination over off-world settlements. Their counterpart was the Liberal Party, but they were never more than the largest minority. Despite claiming to be more progressive, their beliefs were no less extreme. They were not so much interested in offering the colonies their freedom as they were telling them to get lost and not to bother Terra anymore. The early 23rd century was a turning point in Earth's history, as the old nations, even the most powerful among them, became subservient to the world government. From 2207, Geneva alone dictated how much money a country would have to contribute to retain representation in Parliament. By this point, the Alliance bureaucrats had mostly supplanted their counterparts at home, achieving dominance over their old masters. Some would argue it was a more symbiotic relationship, with those holding the true power allowing Parliament ever greater freedoms in exchange for support they would use to increase their popularity among the voting populace. Further advancements in Kearney-Fushida technology around the turn of the century allowed for jumps of up to 30 light-years in distance. This development came more or less at the same time as another, the invention of jump sails. Rather than rely on a ship's fusion reactor to recharge the hyperdrive, vessels could now deploy an enormous solar kite made from a material that absorbed the energy emitted by a star. This gave colony ships functionally unlimited range, or at least as far as their food and water supplies would take them. Early examples were an astonishing 50 kilometers in diameter, but later refinements brought this down to under 2,000 meters. These improvements only accelerated the outward expansion of humanity. The next two grand surveys highlighted just how quickly things were getting beyond the control of Earth to manage. In 2219, there were 316 colony worlds within 120 light-years, and just 16 years later, that number had soared to 628 inside a 250 light-year radius. This was the Terran Alliance at its absolute apex. For the past 150 years, it had gorged itself on the fruits of the off-world colonies, becoming ever more bloated and dysfunctional over time. The following year, Parliament's mismanagement would finally catch up with it. Of those 600 plus planets, less than 10% would take their side in the coming conflict. After 40 years of cooling, Venus's surface temperature had reached a milder 30 degrees Celsius, allowing for the next stage of the terraforming process to begin. Several hundred skyscraper-sized atmospheric processors had been constructed over the past 4 decades, and these were now lowered down to the surface to begin their work. Over time, they cleaned up the air and halted the toxic acid rain. While this process was ongoing, human habitation moved from space to the clouds, where thousands lived among huge floating cities. There, they could enjoy more tolerable living conditions than in orbit, but still above the thick, soupy atmosphere below. The air itself would become the fuel for the final stage of Dome's undertaking. Colossal fusion rockets burned around the clock for years on end to shorten the planet's 8-month rotational period down to a more bearable 48 hours. Project Aphrodite concluded in the mid-2200s, barely half a century after it had begun. Faster than anyone had dared to imagine, Venus had been transformed and was now able to support life. The surface was covered in nitrogen-rich chemicals, which when paired with artificial soil, acted as fantastic fertilizers for agriculture. In time, Venus would become the breadbasket of the Terran Alliance, developing the largest population of any planet within the solar system save Earth itself. On May 25, 2235, the house of cards that was the Terran Alliance's dominion over so many stars finally collapsed. President DuPont declared the planet Freedom's independence, and as word spread, several other systems followed their lead. Because of the distances involved, it took 8 months for their proclamation to make its way back to Terra. It did not come as a surprise. Conflict had in fact been anticipated for some time. There is some debate among historians about which was the first planet to secede, with opinions split evenly between Denebola and Freedom. Our best records suggest that the former did so later in 2235, without knowledge of events elsewhere. On account of its proximity to Earth, their declaration of independence reached Geneva first, but Denebola at the time was a tiny colony of little importance, and was not perceived as a credible challenge. While the government debated what action to take, 2 high-ranking officers of the Alliance Global Militia took it upon themselves to make the decision on their behalf. At the time Freedom's missive arrived in January 2236, the 2nd Interstellar Strategic Combined Assault Force had been on maneuvers around Saturn. They were primed for an immediate response, or as immediate as any action can be with months of travel time involved. Unbeknownst to the Alliance World Parliament, the Interstratcaf jumped out of the Sol system within days, tasked with bringing the rebel groups to heel. Most believed that this would take a mere 18 weeks. The general who gave the order later insisted that there was an understanding that the Alliance Global Militia would use intimidation only, as firing even a single shot could incite widespread rebellion. The initial group of secessionists lay primarily in a forward direction from Earth. The complicated reality of sending messages between planets meant that most of the outer reaches remained in the dark as to what was happening. Ironically, the first time many heard of the rebellion was when the Alliance governors suddenly ordered them to contribute troops and supplies to assist in the effort to crush the renegade worlds. Had the colonial marines not already been dispatched, the response to these calls might have dissuaded any further action. All across space, colonies refused the demands, leaving the AGM in the lurch. The reinforcements they believed were following up behind them would not be coming. The bloody ambush that was sprung upon their arrival at the target jump points heralded the viciousness that would go on to define the Outer Reaches rebellion. Both Zenith and Nadir had been extensively mined. Small vessels packed with explosives launched themselves at the materializing strike cruisers, assault carriers, and attack transports before they could accelerate. These suicidal tactics resulted in the deaths of 10% of the task force before anyone made landfall. Once the colonial marines did touch down, they did so with a vengeance. There are countless stories of Terran soldiers reveling in the carnage as they laid waste to entire communities. One of the worst incidents took place on Summit, where over 4 months, more than 10,000 civilians were massacred by the 23rd Alliance strikers. Similar carnage was unleashed by the 14th and 29th Alliance Special Combat Battalions when they attacked the University of Thebes on Alexandria. The planetary militia attempted to fight them off, but suffered 3,000 casualties over 4 months in the effort. The epicenter of the rebellion, Jefferson City on Freedom, was always going to be one of the hotspots of the conflict. 1,500 people were garrisoned within defensive structures the planet had spent years constructing in expectation of an armed conflict. Outside were the 4th Paracavalry Division, approximately 6,000 soldiers of the Alliance Global Militia. The initial assault on June 15th had ended in disaster, when President DuPont had infiltrated their lines and managed to capture a number of mobile artillery platforms. In an act of barbarity, the Marine General ordered the dead colonists to be loaded onto aircraft and dropped over the city as a means of crushing the enemy's morale. On August 25th, the Alliance strikers arrived from Summit, and that night, the combined forces pushed into the city. 12 hours of slaughter claimed the lives of all but 70 colonists, but the price they paid was equally high, some 2,000 Marines dying in the effort. Despite the cost, the Terran Alliance has succeeded in winning the opening battles of the war. Unfortunately for them, the Outer Reaches rebellion was only just beginning. DuPont and his few dozen survivors took to the hills and began a guerrilla campaign. Similar resistance movements sprung up on every world the AGM landed on. Without the support they had been counting on from supposedly loyal colonies, the Alliance was forced to turn to third parties in order to supply both themselves and the conquered populations with the food and water they relied upon. The neutral Ryan cartel was able to secure permission to continue trading, but like his father before him, Ryan was secretly a firm supporter of colonial independence. By carrying word of the bloodbaths to other neighbouring systems, dozens more seceded from the Terran Alliance over the next few months. Rebel leaders were able to communicate by stowing away aboard the ice ships. Their ability to coordinate actions between themselves quickly surpassed the thinly stretched Alliance Navy. By the end of the first year, the rebellion had spread to more than 50 worlds, with no end in sight. The AGM had been revealed as the paper tiger it was, encouraging further revolution across Alliance space. On Terra itself, the Liberal Party received newfound support, and used their expanded influence to block additional funding for the campaign. This in turn forced the Expansionists to impose harsher quotas on their off-world holdings to make up the deficit, a cycle which led to an ever greater number of colonies declaring their independence. The writing was on the wall for the Terran Alliance's efforts to retain control over the Outer Reaches. Over 250,000 men and women had been deployed to the colonies, but 3 times as many had taken up arms against them. 18 months on, hundreds of thousands lay dead. In July 2237, 90% of the colonial marines were recalled back to the interior worlds, without any official acknowledgement or public statement. A ceasefire was never declared. Terra had simply lost interest in continuing the fight, and swept the whole sordid business under the rug. Just as predicted, the operation was doomed from the start. Now the question on everyone's lips was whether this defeat would bring down the entire Terran Alliance. And that wraps up the penultimate chapter of the Terran Alliance history series. This one covered a slightly shorter period in time, a little under 50 years in total, but it ended with perhaps the defining moment of the Terran Alliance's history, that being the Outer Reaches Rebellion. Now, across all the sourcebooks I've read, we're never given a very clear definition of what constitutes the Outer Reaches. Now, naturally, of course, the further you go from Terra, the fewer star systems are going to be colonized, and so the pockets of civilization are going to go ever further apart from one another. but there's no hard cutoff between the core worlds and the outer reaches. But contextually, I want to point out that the so-called, fringe, what in their day would have been the Periphery, is still very much kind of core inner sphere worlds in later eras. It was actually the Outer Reaches Rebellion that caused a number of exoduses out into very distant space, namely those being the refugees that formed the Taurian Concordat and the Rimworld's Republic, what would become the Periphery in later eras. Now, I'm not discussing any of that in this series. I want to keep 100% focused on the Terran Alliance itself. Now, we've got just one more chapter in this series, and that's going to go over the final years of the Terran Alliance, describing how Earth becomes locked in this standoff between two political parties, and ultimately how they bring down the entire thing on their heads. I want to make a note in this outro and say there are a lot of conflicting dates over the 5 years that kind of follow the Outer Reaches Rebellion. I have done my best to unravel them and try and create some kind of cohesive through line, but the problem is every single one of the house books mentioned a date or two, and each one of the kind of newer handbooks would go back to their respective original house book and copy that date forwards, so there's never been a newer sourcebook to make clear the situation because each one is just quoting the contradictory dates from their earlier equivalent. It's not a big thing, but I'll mention it now just to preempt some maybe confusion over that. Anyway, that's all for this outro. Thank you again for watching. I hope you've been enjoying this mini-series. In fact, I know you guys have been. You've had some incredible comments from you, so thanks for that. Now, if you want to support me in making these videos, there's a number of different ways you can do it. You can give the video a like, you can share it around with other people who might be interested in this sort of thing. Both of those are helpful in getting the YouTube algorithm to pay attention to it and start promoting it to other people. If you've got any questions or if you want to let me know what you thought of the video, please leave a comment. I love reading them and I try to respond to as many of you as I can. And if you are interested, I have a Patreon that's linked in the description where I post videos early. At the time of recording this, there are currently 2 episodes there that aren't up on YouTube, but we're a little out of sync, so I'll let you have a look over there and see. Thank you once more for all the support you've offered during this series and going back further to past videos as well. I really appreciate it, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys next time for the finale, Memento Mori.